Stevve Davis is one of Adelaide's most famous podcasters. Podcasting himself since 2005, Stevve has, over the years, produced many hundreds of podcast episodes, not only for himself, but also for his clients. By day, Stevve runs a successful marketing business. Indeed, Stevve has plenty of high-caliber qualifications to say that he is knowledgeable enough to do so, and the experience to back up his judgment with facts. He has runs on the board, not only for the way he creates podcasts for himself, but also the creation, production and marketing of podcasts for his clients. On the recent 10th anniversary of his fabulous podcast, The Adelaide Show, which has won several awards, Stevve took time out to answer some questions sent in by a student of podcasting. What Stevve has to say is the podcast equivalent of liquid gold.
Here's something just a little bit different. It is the 10th anniversary of the Adelaide Show podcast. We are halfway through our month of Tuesdays, and I've just received an email from a student in a South Australian school. I won't mention names because of privacy, etc. But they're doing a project, a podcasting project, and they've asked me a couple of questions about it. Well, 13 questions to be precise. I thought it'd be just as easy to share my answers publicly in case it's useful to anybody else. So the first question, how do you create a podcast? Do you just record, or is there a need for editing? That all depends. At the base level, yes, you just need to record. Obviously, some more thinking needs to go into it than that, and that's going to be covered in a later question. Editing is a good thing, because if you're new to this and you're waffling a bit, or you lose track, or if you have a guest, if they go off track, you want to cut that stuff out and keep the essence of it. Probably the biggest thing that I would encourage anyone to do is, if you have a guest on for your podcast, don't just say, right, here's our guest. Tell us your background. No, that's your responsibility. You give us a succinct version of the background. And then if you want to, maybe ask a specific question that relates their background to the topic of this discussion. And that just makes it better for the listener. All right, let's have a look at question number 2. How fast should I be talking? Well, probably about the pace I'm talking now is going to suit most people. I wouldn't go much faster than this. You could go slower, but I think if you can keep this pace in your conversation, there's enough energy to keep people connected, knowing that many podcast listeners play podcasts at a slightly faster speed. I don't like that, but some of them do. Number 3, how do I keep listeners interested? Well, editing is going to help you because you cut to the chase. Try to open up with an intriguing hook as to what's coming up and then work your way through that material. That's a good ploy, and stay on track. In fact, it really helps if you can imagine what an ideal listener is like. Just imagine, pick someone you know that you think represents the person this is best for, and picture them, or put a picture of them in front of you as you do your podcast, which will keep you focused, remembering they have to listen to this in their own time. They have to want to find it and listen. So we owe them that. That'll be a good start, generally. How can I not draw? Got a funny feeling there's a typo in that. There's some of that question didn't make it through, so I'll skip number 4. Number 5, do you have any expert tips? Well, the intro thing I just talked about was one. Expert tips. Look, map out some questions and think of a logical progression that you can go through with your topic, but don't just do the questions on their own. It takes a bit of practice. I've done more than 50,000 interviews in my career. Having that background is nice. It's like having a general idea of how to get across town, but every now and then there's a detour, or there might be an interesting deviation you can take. Go for it. So 2 things. Listen as you talk, as the person's answering the question, if you're doing an interview-based podcast. And if there's something you don't quite understand, pause, ask them. So, oh, what do you mean by that? Or how do you define that? Because one of my bugbears is listening to people doing interviews where they ask a question, and then once the person stopped, they just ask the next question. And there might be some really interesting stuff left on the table that is just ignored at that point. And make sure the room you're recording in is quiet. Make sure they're close to the microphone. The further away, the more you're going to get that boomy, echoey noise. Sound is crucial. Ideal length these days, somewhere around the 20-minute mark, is pretty good for an episode. Some do shorter, some do a lot longer. Adelaide show, a lot longer. Whereas the one I do talking about marketing, we aim for 30-ish minutes there. This Medical Life, 30 to 45. What I do a comedy one, Hard Knock Knocks. That's about 30 minutes. That's around the mark. I think you find 20-ish minutes is about the average around the world. How can I make it interesting? It all depends on your topic. I think you mentioned there's a fish aspect to what you're planning to do a podcast on in your case. So why would someone care? What's in it for them? How are you going to surprise them with something they'd like to know? What you're doing, whether you're just sharing stuff you've learned or whether you're interviewing someone, you're there on their behalf to try and get some interesting things to help them either have fun or, in this case, probably more to the point, learn something about the industry. We don't get to sit down with people who know their stuff very often. So you're providing that service. You're giving us a chance to have an expert sit with us and speak into our ears, give us an insight. Stay on that focus. 8, what should the podcast structure be? The intro, the info, the ending? That is a big question. It all depends. I do like having a structure. So for the Adelaide show, we have the SA Drink of the Week as our first segment always. I do a very quick intro to tease what's coming up. Then the drinking segment, the drink tasting, the wine tasting segment, then our main interview, and then we always finish with a song by an original South Australian artist, or by an artist, an original song. You know what I mean? So that's my structure for that one. For others, we come up with something different. For the talking about marketing, we've got 4 segments we do every single episode. So the topics change, but people get to learn what the structure is about. So intro, just tell us up front what's coming. Don't have a long build up to it. Cut to the chase. Hey, in this episode, you're going to learn about the 3 biggest threats to South Australia's fish breeding industry, or whatever it is that you're talking about. So bang, you've got our attention. Now we're going to listen in. The info, I think, is covered in the gist, the guts of what you do. And the ending, let people know where they can find more information, or pose a question for them to ponder and maybe respond to you for their comments to be included in an upcoming episode, if that's how it's going to work. Just know there's not a lot of that happens in podcast land, because people are often listening when they don't have a ready access to make a note or remind themselves, and then they forget. They may want to respond to you, but it's just not the nature of the beast typically. Number 9, what are the steps to creating a podcast? Work out the show, the structure. First, get some recording gear. I just have a Zoom H5 recorder. Any good recorder will do. You can record straight into a computer as well. The microphones are important. What have I got there? I use the Shure SM58s. They're my microphones, but I've got some good lapel mics that I use that I plug into my smartphone. They record good sound as well. The key thing is having some good sound. So for doing it, we need that. And then editing, I just use Audacity, which is free open source software. You can put it on a Mac, you can put it on a PC. That does the job. It cuts out the stuff you don't want, shifts stuff around, and so on and so forth. They're probably the 2 things. Then, of course, exporting. Export is MP3. And depending on what software you're using, I always make sure I export at the highest bit rate possible. I think it's 320 Mbps. Just gives a nice round sound to the MP3 file. And, of course, the other part of it is you need to upload it somewhere. If it's going to be a true podcast, You need a host to hold those files that can serve them out and make sure they're available through Apple Podcasts, through Google Podcasts, through Spotify, etc. A good one to start with is Podbean, podbean.com. They've got a free entry level to get you started, and then about $8 or $9 US a month for hosting, which is not a bad way to go. There'll be some other ones. Poke around. They're changing all the time, but Podbean have been around for ages. And then once that is there, it'll teach you. It's got steps on how to connect your podcast to all those podcast avenues. And also don't forget uploading it to YouTube as well. I haven't been doing that. I'm about to start doing it more. There's a lot of people there who only like listening to podcasts through YouTube. So either video what you're doing and have it up there, or just get your sound file, throw it into something so it can have an image, just a still image and the sound, and get it onto YouTube, because you'll pick up some extra listeners that way. When and where are sound effects useful? Depends on the style. I don't know that you're going to need them. If you're doing one of those podcasts of just people sitting around a table chewing the fat, yeah, maybe some podcasts add a bit of fun. We played with that in the early days of the Adelaide show just for a bit of a laugh, but it soon wore off. That said, if you're out and about in nature and doing some recordings, softly having some atmospheric background noise of, in this case with fish, bubbling tanks or whatever, is good. Too much, though, becomes annoying. So experiment, see how you can do that. So it just adds some character, some richness to the sound, but doesn't dominate. That was question number 10. 11. Would the video editor on Microsoft work? Clipchamp for creating a podcast? Audacity, which is the one I mentioned before, is the one I recommend. 12. Is humor useful for podcasts? Again, depends. I think there's always a place for humor. Going out for the sake of making a joke, though, hard gig. There's a natural chemistry that makes most comedy work, which you don't always get in a podcast environment unless you're sparring, bouncing off a partner or a guest. So it depends on your character. There's no right or wrong answer there. But just think about it. Most conversations with humans, we always have a little bit of a joke along the way, and that just adds a bit of smile, a bit of sparkle, keeps us engaged. And number 13, what else should I include in podcasts other than the information? Your personality. What's your take on it? How do you connect the dots between your lived experience and the topic that you're covering? Why do you care? I mean, you don't want all about you, but sometimes that connecting, grounding your experience so you're surprised by what you're learning, or you can add an extra bit of spin, an angle to a conversation, to a question, that's useful. You're there. Partly, people who listen to podcasts, they build an affinity, they build a relationship with the podcaster, and it's a very intimate thing. We're in someone's ears, and it's just our brains, which have evolved slowly, that's still creating one side of a relationship. So it's a lovely place to be. It's an honor. It's a privilege. So on that front, what you should include is a little bit of yourself. And part of that is, don't be afraid to ask the dumb questions. If someone says something you don't quite understand what they mean, ask them. And be a little bit dogged. Don't just let them get off the hook. Hook, fish, see? See it through to the end. Not to be nasty about it, but just if you're driven by curiosity, if you can bottle your curiosity and honestly want to learn, I think that will make a good podcast for everyone. There you go. Hope that's helpful. All the best with your project.
Well, liquid gold there with Steve's thoughts and views. If you want to find him online, check out any of the links in the PDF document that supports this podcast edition. Or else head to Stevve Davis, stevedavis.com.au and find out more about my great friend. Next episode, we'll look at some of the big corporate names who are podcasting and consider some great reasons why your organisation should be getting amongst it for better internal communications. Ciao!